Now, I want to get to some other news that is of interest to me, and that's what we talk about on the World According to Zig podcast. Obviously, we've been doing an awful lot over the last couple of months on the aftermath of the HBO Leaving Neverland so-called documentary, I believe a fictional film about Michael Jackson's alleged sexual abuse of James Safechuck and Wade Robson. This week is the 10th anniversary of Michael Jackson's passing. And because of Leaving Neverland, it's not going to be nearly as big a deal in the news media as it would have been otherwise. In fact, there have been articles, including in Variety, about all the projects that got canceled or scrubbed because of fear of the toxicity of Leaving Neverland. Interestingly, Variety, who clearly has a huge agenda here, that I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it might be at the corporate level. Variety also put out an article this week, I think it was this week, within the last week or so, where they listed the 15 best films of 2019, and somehow Leaving Neverland made the list of the top 15 films.
You cannot be serious!
Now, if they had said fictional films, I might have said, okay, fine, but this is absurd. It's particularly absurd when the decisions are being made by film critics about a movie about alleged sexual abuse where the critics clearly have no idea of the facts. And so we have this bizarro world where film critics who are very poorly equipped to be evaluating these kind of situations somehow become experts and end up making incredibly important decisions about whether or not a story is viewed as credible or not. This reminds me a lot of the whole Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky situation, because in that situation, almost all the decisions of credibility were being made by moronic sports writers. And let me tell you, I mean, you got a sense of that from my interview with Len. Having spent a lot of time with sports media people, they are about the dumbest people you could possibly find.
Correct.
I mean, they are clearly not qualified to be making decisions about whether or not old sexual abuse allegations are credible or not, especially when most of them are remarkably liberal and very politically correct. That's one of the things people don't understand about the sports media. The sports media might be more liberal and more politically correct than the news media. Part of it is because of something Len and I talked about. Fear of losing your gig, because nobody wants to lose a gig in the sports media, because they're even tougher to come by, good ones, than in the news media. And let's face it, people decide to become sports media people not because they're into reporting or the truth or whatever. They want to go to games. They want to go to games for free. And so these are not people that are well equipped to do this, and it's the same situation with Variety. But back to Michael Jackson and the anniversary of his death coming up this week, the 10th anniversary. This is going to be a problem for the Jackson estate because it is going to further the perception that Michael Jackson is toxic. Now, it was not decapitating, Leaving Neverland, but it absolutely harmed Michael Jackson, the ability to do Michael Jackson-related projects. How much this is the case and how long that impact will be felt is still very much up in the air. And there are two ways to correct this if you're a Michael Jackson fan. One is you combat the film, which, as I know better than anybody, is incredibly difficult to do because all the rules are on the other side. All the rules were written by the pro-sex abuse people, the people that believe that everybody's abuse claim is always real, no matter how ridiculous, no matter how absurd, no matter how contradicted by the facts. And so having fought these battles in the past, I now think that there's a better way for the Jackson estate to do this. And I want to be clear, I have not posed this to anybody within the Jackson estate. I'm just spitballing, and you know, if they're Jackson fans who are listening to this who think this is a good idea, maybe this can get some traction. But you want to salvage Michael Jackson's long-term persona and viability within the entertainment industry? Here's what I think you do. I think one of the ways you do this is you just completely ignore the film. And I think you got to spend a little bit of money in a strategic fashion in order to save money in the long run. You know, there are those who might have said, well, maybe the estate should have done something to celebrate the 10th anniversary of his passing. First of all, you don't celebrate his passing, especially the way he died. It was a horrible way he died. And so I can totally understand why the estate wouldn't want to do that. And it's not the right time. And, you can't create your own anti-documentary because it won't have any credibility and you won't be able to get as large an audience as you would. The media will ignore it. And so you're running uphill against the wind on ice whenever you do that. I'm not saying you don't try, but that's not the way you do it. I got an idea that I think would actually work. Now, it would cost some money, but here's what I think the estate ought to do. Again, I have no idea how realistic this is, but if I was in charge of the estate, here's what I would do. I would secretly purchase a Super Bowl commercial celebrating Michael Jackson's halftime show at the Rose Bowl back in 1993. You ignore Leaving Neverland completely. And then all of a sudden, either just before or after next year's Super Bowl, up pops a super well-produced retrospective on Michael Jackson doing the halftime show at the Super Bowl. You either congratulate whoever was doing the Super Bowl halftime show that year or you wish them luck. You don't do any publicity surrounding it. You knock people's socks off. It's going to cost a lot of money. Maybe if you're lucky, you even get a corporate partner to go in with you on it. You pay the bill because no one's going to want to pay the money. But in order to make it seem legit, you partner up with some sort of corporation that makes it appear as if the stench is off of Michael Jackson. People get their socks knocked off. It blows up Twitter. And no one's going to do anything about it after it airs because then the focus is back on the game and the news media is focused on the coverage of the game. So if you did this right and it was well produced and you kept it secret and all of a sudden in the Super Bowl, you got Michael Jackson right there, it's going to erase all the stench and go almost all of it. And going forward, he's no longer toxic. So that's what I would do. I would just, at this point, ignore the movie. You're going to have to spend a few $1 million to get this done, but I think it's very doable, and that's what I would do if my goal was to try to salvage Michael Jackson's image in popular culture going forward, something that I think we're going to see the damage having been done this week on the 10th anniversary of his passing. There are several other stories involving questionable claims of sexual abuse that I wanted to mention. And I hate this subject. I want to make it very clear. I can't stand the fact that I am one of the very few people willing to go, hey, wait a minute, these stories don't make a lot of sense. But I feel now almost an obligation to do so because I know no one else will. And this didn't get a lot of publicity, but I want to at least mention it. There's a Los Angeles area track coach by the name of Conrad Mainwaring, who's a former Olympian. He's not an American. He comes from, I think, an African country. He is a black man. He's a former Olympian who has trained Olympic champions. And he's been a track coach independent for a very long time. Well, he got charged with at least a couple of counts of child sexual molestation, although just to be clear, the youngest allegation here was of 14 years old. The oldest was I think 21 or 22. So these were older male track athletes who were 14 to 22. Now, right off the bat, I'm going, really? Seriously? Post-pubescent track athletes, 14 to 21, 22. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. I guess it's theoretically possible. But here's the quote in the article that really started to give me the heebie-jeebies, because this reminded me an awful lot of the Michael Jackson case and a little bit of the Penn State situation as well. The LAPD was quoted as saying that Mainwaring got away with this for so long because, quote, his athletes were so driven to perfect their craft, he was able to victimize them without them even realizing it. Okay. Come on. I'm sorry. As soon as you tell me someone didn't even realize, they're post-pubescent boys, and a man, no evidence, by the way, that they're homosexual, a man allegedly sexually abuses you, your coach, and you don't even realize it because you're so enamored by your coach and you so want to be an Olympian that you don't even understand that this happened, which, of course, is the James Safechuck and Wade Robson argument on Michael Jackson. They didn't even realize that they had been sexually abused until many years later. I'm not ready to call bullshit, but I'm smelling bullshit. I'm smelling there's a problem here. So I don't know. This guy could be totally guilty, but that quote really bothered me. And I'll tell you what else bothers me about the story. It didn't originate with an LAPD investigation, apparently. The LAPD investigated because ESPN was starting an investigation of this guy. That's problematic to me because when you have allegations like this, the perception of credibility is everything. And when a major quote-unquote news organization like ESPN, Outside the Lines, is essentially vouching for a victim, doesn't mean they're not telling the truth. I want to make that clear. But when they're vouching for a victim, and that's the first time that law enforcement has heard about them, that gives them instant credibility. And now everything that person says is seen as far more credible than if they just came about them by happenstance and, the LAPD started their own investigation. And I clearly don't trust ESPN after what they did in the whole Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky situation. So I am far from willing to say this guy is innocent. He could be guilty as hell. But there's some red flags in that particular situation. There are also some red flags in the allegation against Donald Trump that he raped a magazine writer over 20 years ago in a department store dressing room. I get into this in some detail in the Individual One podcast, so I want to refer you to that. Make sure you check that out. And I don't know whether or not this person is telling the truth, but I do believe that the news media is handling this about as well as they could because there's some major problems in the big picture with the story. It happened forever ago. This person didn't say anything when he started running for president. Now he's running for re-election. This is all part of a book. It's a book that's about how many men sexually abused this woman, essentially. There's no corroboration, although there are two people who say that she told them at the time, but we don't know who these two people are. We don't know how much their accounts match her current account. Things change over time. Things change after Me Too. Trump, of course, is strongly denying this. He's denying in a way that's not credible because he said he never met this person in his life, and there's a photograph of the two of them together. That doesn't mean he raped her, but it just means Trump's a moron for making that claim. So check out the Individual One podcast if you're interested in more details on that. Somewhat related, although actually very related, since I happen to have met Donald Trump backstage at the Today Show when Matt Lauer had interviewed me and Dottie Sandusky, the third interview I had done, a major interview with Matt Lauer on the Today Show. Matt Lauer was in the news this week because he was completely erased and made into a non-person when the Today Show celebrated their 25th anniversary in their studio. They did a 6-minute retrospective in which Matt Lauer was not seen nor heard of. He's been erased like it's 1984. And this Matt Lauer thing really bothers me. I got to know Matt pretty decently well. I mean, when you do 3 major interviews with somebody, they were high profile, they were contentious. One of them was at the Sandusky home where I got Matt Lauer to come. I mean, that was a miracle. That was maybe the most incredible thing I've ever done in my career that resulted in nothing good happening, really. But I got Matt Lauer to come to Dottie Sandusky's house and interview her and me for an hour. I spoke to him extensively before and after. I've been in foxholes with him. I don't like Matt Lauer. He's very good at what he does or did. He's a very good interviewer. In fact, I've told him he is the most difficult person I've ever gone up against. And that's about as good a compliment as I can give an interview, because I've been involved in a lot of high-profile situations. I've done hundreds of interviews, both being interviewed and being the interviewer. And I got to say, Matt Lauer was the most formidable foe I ever went up against. And in fact, it wasn't close. It wasn't close. He was that good. And so I know him. I don't particularly like him as a person. I think he was arrogant and a bit liberal, and he did me no favors in a lot of these situations. But I have seen him in circumstances where I do not believe him to be a bad person. I've talked in the past where at one point he even stood up for me when he did not need to stand up for me. He stood up for the truth. That doesn't mean he didn't ever sexually assault somebody, by the way. But I know the facts of these situations, and I think he got completely railroaded on a political basis because NBC needed a scalp after they had killed the Ronan Farrow investigation of Harvey Weinstein. And he was a big contract and an easy guy to get rid of because he's a white male who had slept around on his wife numerous times, and he ends up getting fired. This is what Matt Lauer got fired over, folks. This is a fact, okay? He got fired because he had an affair with a colleague at the Olympics without informing his employer. Now, he's Matt frickin' Lauer. You think he's going to say, I realize that our human resources handbook says that if I'm going to have an affair with this colleague that I need to inform you. He's not going to do that because obviously his wife might find out. I mean, more than one person knows in the media business. Everybody's going to know, and it might get reported. So why is he going to do that, especially when he's a superstar and he's been coddled his whole career? So I'm not defending it. I'm just telling you what he got fired for. Once that happens, the floodgates open and everyone's out to get Matt Lauer because he can't defend himself and he's been castrated. So everything after that is just bullshit. And there's not one on the record in-name allegation from one woman claiming that he ever did something to that person that was non-consensual. There's not one allegation of that. And yet he's been completely destroyed, erased, probably no chance of a comeback, any realistic comeback. And in comparison to the way other people have been treated, I don't think it's fair. Somewhat related to that, O.J. Simpson is back on Twitter. Now, he hasn't really been embraced by the mainstream media yet. To my knowledge, Twitter hasn't even verified him yet. Although there's a good argument to be made, it's not technically O.J. Simpson's Twitter feed. It's clearly creating content that is real from O.J. Simpson, like O.J. Simpson videos. But it appears as if the account may actually belong to a lawyer of O.J. Simpson's. Regardless, effectively, it's O.J. Simpson's Twitter account. He's been making all sorts of crazy videos, claiming he's back. He's going to get his revenge on his critics. Who the hell knows what that means? Although, stay away from the sharp objects, folks. And he chose the 25th anniversary of him slaughtering his ex-wife Nicole and her friend Ron Goldman. I mean, so right off the bat, this guy's got. I mean, obviously he's got major problems when you slaughter two people. But it's been disturbing to see how many people who have been rejoicing over OJ's social media presence. He's got, I don't know how many followers now, but it was almost 1 million last time I checked. And this is a guy who really ought to just be ignored. I mean, I've retweeted it a couple times just to show that it's out there and to try to correct the record on some things. And so it is a tough call. What do you do in this kind of situation? But I have been saying for a long time, I'm amazed he's been able to stay this quiet. Because when you have that level of celebrity and you want attention that badly and you're that much of a narcissist and it's that easy in the social media age to get attention, and he's obviously got nothing to lose now, it's been amazing to me he's been able to keep quiet for as long as he has. Obviously that's over with, and I've seen a lot of people online, and I agree with this, predict that he's probably going to become a Donald Trump fan. Would not surprise me at all if one time in the 2020 campaign that after O.J. Simpson endorses Donald Trump, that Donald Trump retweets the endorsement just to fuck with people. I could totally see that kind of a scenario happening. Yeah, I could see that occurring. Again, somewhat related to O.J., a situation where the media has largely blown it, and we have some people who should be in prison and aren't, in my view, and some people's world have actually been exonerated. Obviously, there's some major differences in the two cases, but I'm segueing to another case that involves Donald Trump, and that is the Central Park Five. I wrote a column finally. I've been attacked on Twitter quite a bit for me raising questions about whether or not the Central Park Five really were exonerated. And I wrote a column for Mediate, which you can check out. It should be at freespeechbroadcasting.com, making the case that, you know what, it's possible the Central Park Five are innocent. It's possible Donald Trump was wrong to call for the death penalty in that case immediately when it happened back in 1989. He bought a full-page ad in the New York Times making that case. That's all possible. But this idea that the media puts out there that the Central Park Five were exonerated is not true. It is not based in fact. It's not based in logic. Everything that the other side points to that claims that the Central Park Five were exonerated can be easily explained, both from a political perspective as well as an evidentiary standpoint. And, you know, one of the things I did not mention in the column, which I urge you to check out, but it goes to the eye level of the evidence in this case, this might be, in some ways, the most compelling argument that the Central Park Five were not innocent. Here's all you need to know. Of the Central Park Five who were, convicted and spent time in prison for this assault and the rape of a white female jogger in Central Park back in 1989, of those five, 4 confessed in detail. Now, there were problems with their confession. They were contradictory and inconsistent, but they clearly confessed on camera videos with their parents there in detail, all right? And they're teenagers. They're not infants. They're not 8 years old. They're teenage boys who have been around the block. They all 4 of the 5 confess, and this is where I'm going with what might be the most interesting piece of evidence that no one ever talks about. I didn't even mention in the column. So 4 of the 5 confess. The 5th also gets convicted and goes to prison for several years based upon the confessions of the other 4. Now think about this, folks. If they're really innocent, that 5th guy should be pissed the fuck off. He should hate the fuck out of the other 4. He spent years in prison because those assholes confessed inaccurately, implicating him in an assault for which he was convicted and sent to prison. Yet oddly, I have found no evidence of him having any animosity towards those other 4. And to this day, they all 5 of them get together constantly. They take pictures together. They're spending their $41 million together. They're all heroes together in the black community and in liberal academia and liberal media circles. Yet no animosity. Now, I could be wrong. I looked for it, couldn't find it, asked for it about it on Twitter. No one said, hey, no, that's not true. Here's this guy said this. He was pissed off. He's mad. He forgives him. No, none of that. Why? Explain that to me. Explain to me why the 5th guy isn't pissed at the 4 that confessed. And there's a perfectly good explanation for what ended up happening with the person who ended up confessing to the crime and being convicted, which then caused the 5 to have their convictions overturned because their DNA, this guy by the name of Reyes, his DNA was found on the victim. And this was, in the liberal mind, this was bum, 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 aha, all these guys were innocent. Their DNA wasn't found. This guy's DNA was found. He confessed. He must be the only person guilty. No. It is perfectly possible, underline possible, and logical, that here's what happened. The 5, maybe with some other guys that got away, beat the crap out of this poor woman in Central Park in 1989. They leave her for dead, just as they say in their confessions. Reyes then comes upon the body, and Reyes is the biggest scumbag on the planet. All right, when he confesses to this, he's already raped and murdered a pregnant woman. I mean, this guy is a sociopath. He's the worst human garbage you could possibly imagine. He comes upon the raped and beaten body, and he rapes her, leaving his semen there. There's even evidence the body was moved, so he could have more privacy as he was raping her, the scumbag. One of the problems in this scenario is it's so horrific, it's so disgusting to think about. No one wants to put the theory out there, but it explains everything, and it makes everybody's confession accurate and everybody guilty. And it certainly does not leave the Central Park Five exonerated, which is what the media refers to them as, and I believe partially to try to embarrass Donald Trump, but he might not have been wrong about that. A couple other real quick stories. Jussie Smollett, remember that story? Well, a judge has said that a special prosecutor will be appointed to look into the decision not to charge him in the fake hate crime that he created, and which I got a lot of credit for having exposed, even though all it took was for me to have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and a mouth that was functioning, and a brain that was functioning, and maybe half a testicle. But hopefully we're going to find out the truth of that outrage. One other thing before we end this episode, the U.S. Open golf tournament took place this past weekend. Gary Woodland was a deserving winner. I was disappointed with how easy Pebble Beach played, partially because the USGA has wussed out, and that is, I think, the most important point, because it shows the way human beings react to criticism. When you get criticized publicly and you're vulnerable to that criticism, you're going to wimp out. And the U.S. Open is no longer the toughest test in golf. They have wussed out because they're afraid of these spoiled brat players complaining about the conditions being too tough. Now, there are those who will say the weather didn't cooperate. That's true. The weather was very benign for all 4 days, and that's partially why the scores were so incredibly low at Pebble Beach, the lowest they've ever been at any U.S. Open at Pebble Beach. Even there, I find something interesting, though. And granted, I'm not claiming you can determine anything based upon 4 or 5 days of weather. But isn't it interesting, folks, in this era where we're supposed to believe that the climate has changed completely, that global warming has changed everything, that we're all going to die because of climate change. Folks, there's this thing in California called the June gloom, right? It's been around for decades. The June gloom. The June gloom is an atmospheric condition that's about as fragile as it gets. You get this gloom in the morning that no one can really predict. It can disappear in 10 minutes if the sun shines brightly enough and breaks through it. And yet, this June, up and down the coast of California, in the midst of horrendous, dramatic climate change that's going to cause the end of civilization, we've had the most consistent, pronounced June gloom of any year that I've lived in California, including today, and I've lived here for 15 years. If there was really climate change, the June gloom would be the most fragile and easily changed atmospheric condition you could possibly imagine. It would move to May, or it would go to July, or it would disappear completely. Instead, here we are, it's June, and there's never been a more pronounced June gloom, at least in the time period I've lived here. And by the way, it's been cold as crap. Now, the whole winter, with the mist, when the hell is summer coming? Please get me some global warming. We just spent a week in Huntington Beach freezing our butts off at the pool because of the June gloom. So anyway, only John Ziegler is going to make a connection to the low scoring at Pebble Beach and the what a bunch of bullshit climate change, global warming theory is. Speaking of Pebble Beach and the U.S. Open, Tiger Woods. I know no one's going to say this. It's kind of like because Trump upset everybody in 2016. No one wants to say he can't win again in 2020 because he pulled off a miracle. Tiger Woods pulled off a miracle at the Masters, and we should all savor it. But based upon the PGA and the U.S. Open, where he looked incredibly mortal, it's looking very much to me like this year's Masters is effectively Jack Nicklaus's 1986 Masters. Jack Nicklaus never won another major, never won any tournament after 1986. In that incredibly dramatic moment that was up until this year's Masters, the greatest Masters ever. It's early. It's still early. Tiger's only 43. He'd probably win another PGA Tour event, but it would not shock me at all based upon what we've seen in the last 2 majors if Tiger never wins another major. He probably will contend. Jack contended in majors after the 1986 Masters, but he never won again. And Tiger's got some physical issues. I think we're going to look back on what happened to the Masters this year and go, holy shit, how the fuck did he ever do that? Because he is an old 43 years old going up against guys who are studs. Brooks Koepka and Gary Woodland are studs. And the game has totally changed, not necessarily for the better, but in a way that's going to make it very difficult for Tiger Woods to compete going forward. That'll do it for this edition of the World According to Zig podcast. Please make sure you share this via social media, Facebook, Twitter, word of mouth, what have you.